Hello and welcome to Indus News with me, Usman Lone. Well, we begin this hour with our top story, and that's in Pakistan, where the Supreme Court grants a 6-month conditional extension to Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa. The court asked the government to make the necessary legislation on the extension of our Army Chief's tenure within 6 months. Prime Minister Imran Khan extended Bajwa's tenure through a notification in August, but the top court suspended it due to irregularities on the manner of extension. While pronouncing the short order, the court said the new legislation must determine the Army Chief's tenure and other terms and conditions of his service. A detailed judgment will be released later. Well, staying with Pakistan, Prime Minister Imran Khan says Pakistan is getting out of its economic crisis. He was addressing a conference of Pakistani and African envoys in Islamabad, and Khan said the country's current account deficit has decreased. Khan said his government is trying to bring investment to Pakistan and said the country will focus on policies towards African countries. Earlier, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi also addressed the conference. Mr. Qureshi said promotion of tourism and enhancing trade ties are Pakistan's top priorities. According to a Foreign Office statement, the conference is aimed at strengthening Pakistan's relations with Africa. Well, the US says the chances of successful negotiations to end the war in Afghanistan are greater than ever before. Speaking in Kabul, US Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley said a deal with the Taliban could be struck soon. Milley said negotiations between the US and the Taliban are ongoing. Pakistan's permanent representative to the UN, Munir Akram, said Islamabad supports Afghanistan's vital pursuit of peace and stability. This sentiment was echoed by China's representative to the UN, Zhang Jun. He said Beijing backs an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned inclusive political process. In Iraq, 14 more people have been shot dead during anti-government protests in Nasiriyah city. Meanwhile, Iran holds the Iraqi government responsible for failing to prevent protesters from burning its consulate in Najaf. Foreign Ministry spokesman Abbas Mousavi said it's Baghdad's responsibility to ensure the safety of diplomatic missions and diplomats. Earlier, a group of anti-government protesters set fire to Iran's consulate in Najaf. Demonstrators chanted "Iran out of Iraq" as flames engulfed the building. The protesters broke into the building, but the Iranian staff had already left. It's the second attack on an Iranian consulate in Iraq this month, after the consulate in Karbala was targeted 3 weeks ago. Deadly protests in Iraq have killed over 350 people in the past 2 months. Well, post-Soviet security bloc, the CSTO, has pledged to support international efforts to preserve the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal. The Collective Security Treaty Organization comprises Russia, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Well, we'll be back with more news after this short break. Hello again, it's good to have you back. Now, Iran says it will soon organize joint naval exercises with Russia and China in the Indian Ocean. Commander of the Iranian Navy, Rear Admiral Hossein Khanzadi, said the plan of the military exercises was compiled last month. He said the participants are currently engaged in preparations for the joint exercises. Khanzadi did not specify the date of the maneuvers. Last month, Russia said Moscow, Beijing and Tehran will train their forces for anti-terrorism and anti-piracy operations in joint military exercises. Well, Syria's government has blocked the Constitutional Committee meetings in Geneva for a third consecutive day. Speaking to reporters, the committee co-chair Hadi al-Bahra accused the government of stalling. Al-Bahra said Damascus wanted to add an item to the agenda that fell outside the basic framework of the constitution. He said Syrian government officials have also rejected all 3 proposals made by the opposition. Ahmed Khuzbari, the committee co-chair representing the Syrian government, said it had wanted to condemn Turkey's operation in northern Syria. The second round of the committee dialogue began on Monday. 2 Turkish soldiers have been killed in a mortar attack on a military base near the Syrian border. Turkey's defense ministry said the shells were fired from the Syrian border town of Tel Abyad. It said Turkish forces immediately retaliated against the attackers. The defense ministry said the attack targeted a base which Turkey seized last month in a military operation against the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Now, China has summoned US Ambassador Terry Branstad to lodge protest with the US President's approval of a law backing anti-government protesters in Hong Kong. China's foreign ministry said the US should immediately stop interfering in its internal affairs. In a statement, China's foreign ministry said the US would bear the consequences for acting arbitrarily on Hong Kong. Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the new US law slanders China. Wang said the repeated enactment of laws against Beijing have seriously poisoned relations between both countries. Hong Kong's government said the US law sent the wrong message to protesters and clearly interfered with the city's affairs. Well, for more on this story, we're joined live by our Beijing correspondent, Patrick Falk. Patrick, thank you for joining us on Indus News. So tell us, what reaction has there been from China on the signing of these bills in the US?
Well, you touched on some of it just a moment ago. A while ago, the foreign ministry, as you can imagine, criticized the move by the US and warned, as you say, there would be consequences if the US continued to act arbitrarily over Hong Kong. In particular, it said that the passage of the bill was a gross violation of China's internal affairs. It also said that it was a gross violation of international law governing the norms of international relations. And it also said that this was an example of the US acting with hegemony, imposing its hegemony over other countries. Now, the Global Times, Chinese media, the state mouthpiece Global Times, also quoted an analyst, and you touched on this a moment ago as well, suggesting that this would encourage rioters and violent acts, and said that it essentially gives umbrella protection to people who are anti-Chinese. The Hong Kong government this morning also issued its response. It said that it would react pragmatically to the developments, which perhaps mean that it doesn't intend to take any steps to retaliate at this time, although there have been concerns that American businesses might be impacted by this. American businesses in Hong Kong in particular, that is.
Patrick, as you say, China's been quite vocal in warning the US not to go ahead with this bill. What do you think their next step will be now in retaliation?
Well, perhaps you could say that, given that it had protested quite sternly about this move. And you mentioned a while ago that on Monday that the foreign ministry had summoned the US ambassador Terry Branstad and given lodged stern complaints about the potential passage of the bill. But remember, the bill was passed almost unanimously by Congress and the Senate. In fact, there was only one vote against in the House, which means that even if President Trump wanted to veto the bill, he wouldn't have been able to do so necessarily, because it would have been overridden by that a huge majority and that huge support for the passage of the Human Rights and Democracy Act in particular.
Patrick, thank you. That was Patrick Falk, our correspondent in Beijing. Now, Seoul says North Korea has test-fired 2 unidentified projectiles into the East Sea. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said the projectiles were fired from South Hamgyong province into coastal waters. Japan's Coast Guard has also confirmed North Korea launched what appeared to be a missile. Its defense ministry said the missile did not enter Japanese airspace. This is the 13th time this year that North Korea has carried out such tests. Pyongyang's military posturing comes amid stalled denuclearization talks with the US. Now to the UK, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has denied the existence of plans to sell the country's National Health Service to US investors. Earlier, Labour's Jeremy Corbyn presented documents saying access to Britain's state-run health service is being discussed in trade talks with the US. Corbyn said the uncensored papers could lead to the runaway privatisation of the country's health service. But Mr Johnson said he wants a dynamic, flourishing economy to allow the government to fund the NHS over the long term.
Complete diversion, that the NHS under no circumstances will be on the table for negotiation, for sale. Look at what we're doing with the NHS. We're funding it massively. And the reason we can fund it massively is because we believe, as One Nation Conservatives, this is a new government with a new approach. We believe in putting big sums now into the NHS and sustainably for the future. But we also believe in driving the long-term growth of the UK economy.
Now, a Swedish court has ordered Russian gas company Gazprom to pay over $2.5 billion in compensation to Ukraine's Naftogaz. Sweden's Court of Appeal upheld the March 28 ruling by the Stockholm Arbitration Court over a dispute on the supply and transit of natural gas. The current 10-year contract between the two countries for the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine runs out at the end of this year. Russia plans to launch two new gas pipelines, the Nord Stream 2 and the Turk Stream, to bypass Ukraine. Last week, Naftogaz said it would seek compensation of nearly $12 billion if Russia stops the gas transit trade in 2020. Now to South America, where Chilean President Sebastián Pinera urges his countrymen to shun violence, saying it can cause irreparable harm to the country. A spike in arson and looting attacks nationwide has rattled Chile. Meanwhile, the peso plunged to a new historic low on Tuesday. Pinera had urged Congress to expedite bills he introduced weeks ago to toughen security and penalties against violence. Bipartisan lawmakers have agreed to push reforms but said the government had not done enough to stem the crisis. Human Rights Watch has expressed its concerns regarding the police brutality during the 5-week-long protests.
The abuses committed by police on the basis of the information and evidence we have are not isolated cases, they are not coincidences, and they are not accidents.
Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world right after this short break. Welcome back. Now in Switzerland, climate activists have delivered a petition of 112,000 signatures calling for greater action on climate change to the Federal Chancellery. The Glacier Initiative collected the signatures in the space of 5 months to trigger a referendum. More in this report.
The initiative's goal is to set a clear target of zero greenhouse gas emissions by abandoning the use of fossil fuels. Although the government said emissions would be cut to zero by 2050, it didn't announce binding measures or a timeline.
Switzerland has signed the Paris Agreement, as have about 130 countries, but politically speaking, not much has been put in place to reach the agreement's target. That is the reason why we launched this initiative, to force impact and decisions, and to have a change.
More than 500 Swiss glaciers have already vanished. If nothing is done to cut emissions, the government says 90% of the remaining 1,500 will be gone by the end of the century. Activists carried Greenpeace lanterns carrying the motto, "We have no planet B."
Yes, we are a bit too late, but we can't go backwards. We should have started 20 years ago, that is for sure. But now we have to put all our efforts in what we can still do. Yesterday's report from the United Nations says that we globally have to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 7.6% every year.
Glacial retreat could have a major impact on the supply of water and affect the Swiss economy.
Now, in business news, the US economy has expanded modestly in the third quarter, with GDP growing at an annualized rate of 2.1%. The latest data exceeds the US Federal Reserve Bank's expectations of economic growth dipping under 2%. In a survey, the Fed said the modest firming of growth reported by the government came alongside a drop in unemployment benefits. The survey showed retailers reporting higher costs from tariffs, while firms generally expect higher prices in the near future. Meanwhile, the US Department of Commerce has said business investment dropped by over 2.5% between July and September. This was better than the expected 3% contraction. The US Central Bank shaved its policy lending rate in October for the third time this year, and it signaled a pause in the easing cycle that started in July. Well, it's 20 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore. But for the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Bye-bye.